think so. Yeah? Okay. And away we go. Welcome to our press conference. On fera notre présentation en anglais, mais je suis contente de répondre aux questions en français. My name is Sean Patrick Stencil. I am a senior energy analyst with Greenpeace Canada. I'm joined today by Teresa McClenahan, Executive Director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association, as well as Carrie Pickering of the Ontario Nurses for the Environment Interest Group of the Registered Nurses of Ontario. We're here today to make a call for public safety. Ontario is unprepared for a major nuclear emergency on the Great Lakes. 1 in 2 Ontarians live near one of the 25 reactors that line the Great Lakes. And these people and communities are vulnerable because the Ontario government has historically chosen not to prepare for major nuclear emergencies. Given we're seeing nuclear accidents at the international level about once a decade, we need to prepare for such events. On Monday, 6 years after the Fukushima anniversary began, the government released its proposals for updating its nuclear emergency plans post-Fukushima. These proposals do a disservice to Ontarians. They make no proposals to tangibly strengthen public safety and ignore key lessons from Fukushima. It's unacceptable, and we're here today to remind the Wynne government that one of its key responsibilities is protecting the public. And we're releasing this statement, a call for public safety, addressing nuclear risks on the Great Lakes, that has been endorsed by over 40 environmental, health, and community groups from across Ontario. And it lays out how the government should update its nuclear emergency plans by, for example, preparing for major accidents, protecting vulnerable communities, protecting drinking water, ensuring transparency and public participation, and striving to meet international best practices. We believe our package would do a better job of keeping Ontarians safe than what was proposed by the government on Monday. And to take a step back, the last time our 3 organizations held a press conference at Queen's Park, it was just days after the Fukushima disaster began in 2011. And at the time, we asked the government to pause its nuclear plans, its plans to build new reactors, as well as rebuilding all of its reactors, the Pickering, Bruce, and Darlington stations. And this was for 2 reasons. One, to fully understand the public safety risks, but also to consider the responsibility the government would have for protecting public safety if it chose to continue to rely on nuclear power. Unfortunately, it didn't do that. And today we've been presented with weak and unacceptable proposals for public safety. That said, this consultation is a good thing, and we thank Minister Lalonde for launching it. But the fact that it took 6 years for the government to propose changes to Ontario's nuclear emergency plans, and after 4 years after the previous minister promised to consult with the public, we think these delays show complacency. And complacency when it comes to public safety is dangerous. To be frank, these proposals are probably weak because the government decided to not consult with the public from the get-go, but instead consult with reactor operators behind closed doors over the past 6 years. We don't think reactor operators should be advising the government on public safety without the public in the room. And our proposals in this package related to transparency and public participation are meant to mitigate these problems moving forward. But in sum, we think it would be negligent of the government to implement these proposals as is. They need to be drastically rewritten. There are too many gaps and weaknesses. And to discuss those gaps and weaknesses, I'll now pass the mic to my colleague, Ms. McClenahan from CELA.
Thank you. The Canadian Environmental Law Association has examined all of the nuclear emergency plans around all of Ontario's operating nuclear power plants in detail since 2011 for the various licensing and environmental assessment hearings. As a result, we've seen the urgent need for much, much better nuclear emergency planning and preparedness in Ontario. Today, I will highlight just 3 of the issues that we've assessed in our initial report card, which is available at the back, on the proposed planning basis discussion paper. First of all, the nuclear emergency plan needs to be able to respond to a Fukushima-level accident. Right now, Ontario's plan is based on a smaller accident. That's not proposed to change in this paper. All of the planning and resources for nuclear emergency planning follow from the scale of the hazard contemplated in the plan. If we haven't got a plan for a Fukushima-level accident, then too many people could end up unprotected during a major off-site accident. The second issue I want to highlight is that the general public is mainly not aware of nuclear emergency planning and protective measures around each of the nuclear power plants in Ontario. This has been demonstrated at each of the recent licensing hearings. This is extremely important because if an accident were to happen, people need to be able to take protective action like taking thyroid blocking pills, KI pills, just before or as radioactive emissions begin to occur, as well as evacuate safely. These measures can prevent harm. We're calling on the government to actively and thoroughly inform residents and businesses within 50 kilometers of each plant that they should pick up the KI that is already in stock to have ready in case of an accident. We're also calling for detailed evacuation planning out to 30 kilometers around each plant and for extensive public education about how they would find out about an accident, how they would evacuate, where they would go, and especially how vulnerable communities like seniors, hospital patients, and children would be evacuated. The third point is that a major concern after a Fukushima-scale accident would be the safety of drinking water in the Great Lakes. For example, Lake Ontario, which would be used for cooling water in the event of an accident at Pickering or Darlington, and is immediately adjacent to those plants, is the drinking water of millions of Americans and Canadians. We urge the government to live up to its commitment to develop a plan for drinking water supplies in case of a severe off-site nuclear plant accident. As Sean Patrick mentioned, the government has just started a public consultation on its nuclear emergency planning basis. This is excellent. Now we urge the government to plan for a severe off-site accident like Fukushima and to make the real changes and upgrades to the plan that would protect Ontario residents in case of such an unwelcome but conceivable accident. We want Ontario's nuclear emergency plans to earn an A+, but they have a long way to go from the D we've given them as an interim report card. Given the level of reliance on nuclear power and the plant locations in Ontario near high populations and next to Lakes Huron and Ontario, much stricter and more robust emergency preparedness is crucial. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you. As President of the Ontario Nurses for the Environment Interest Group of RNAO, I urge strong emergency preparedness regarding nuclear risks on the Great Lakes. My association is very concerned about the health risks of nuclear power. As long as Ontario continues to run nuclear plants, it must reduce those risks by developing a comprehensive emergency plan. The 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster provides many lessons. Firstly, nurses are at the front lines when such disasters happen and must be fully involved in the planning process. The planning must be comprehensive, and for nurses would include preparation for radiation exposure screening, triage, decontamination, treatment for radiation, evacuation, and attending to the needs of those evacuated. Planning must ensure identification and commitment from all necessary resources, which would include key hospitals and other health facilities, decontamination centres, equipment, materials, and personnel. To ensure resources can be rapidly mobilised in the event of a disaster, it is essential that personnel involved receive appropriate training. For example, nurses must learn to identify vulnerable populations in the shadow of nuclear plants, how to screen for acute radiation syndrome, and identify people with the highest priority for treatment. Nurses will also need to know how to best decontaminate exposure victims and how to handle contaminated clothing and water. Dealing with the fear and anxiety associated with a nuclear event is also important. When the Fukushima disaster happened, nurses were afraid to come to work. They did not know if it was safe. Training will reduce this problem. When nurses understand the health consequences, they can direct the public and keep calm. This is especially important when evacuations are required and displaced people are in need of greater support and treatment. If a nuclear disaster happened now, few Ontario nurses would have the benefit of this kind of training. We must learn the lessons from the Fukushima disaster so we can prepare our nurses and the health system to cope with a worst-case nuclear scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're welcome to take questions if there are any.
I was just a little confused about one detail. I think you were talking about a 50-kilometer radius for KI pills, but then a 30-kilometer radius for evacuation. Why is that?
So detailed evacuation planning. We've seen, for example, at Fukushima that there was evacuation out to 55 kilometers, but that was weather dependent and circumstantial to that day. We think it's reasonable to do detailed evacuation planning to 30 kilometers, but absolutely the plan needs to be able to respond beyond that. The secondary zone, which is 50 to 80 kilometers, depending on which plant you're looking at, is the area in which potassium iodide pills should be pre-distributed, because we can't conceive of actually getting the KI pills into people's hands at the time of an accident to that extent.
Just to follow up on that, though, to show where we are sitting in relation to other jurisdictions with KI, Belgium earlier this year made a commitment to expand its KI availability out to 100 kilometers around each of its plants. And that's because when you're preparing for a larger accident, you need to prepare for a larger geographic area. So KI will be available to everyone within 100 kilometers of Belgian plants, and they'll also have plans in place to inform citizens that they should pick it up. And there's no such recommendation for that here.
How likely do you think it is that the government's going to take you up on this through the consultations?
You want to try that one?
I think we have the same interest, or should have the same interest, which is that given that we have such high populations around some of the, in the case of Pickering, oldest operating plants in the world, and such a high reliance on nuclear power at the moment in Ontario, and the fact that we're spending billions and billions of dollars to refurbish many of those plants right now, it's very fair to say that we need to protect the citizens who actually live in the shadow of those plants and who would be the ones most at risk if something were to go wrong. And the only reason not to do it is either to think that an accident is so improbable that it can't happen. That is not a tenable opinion to hold in the wake of real experience in the last 40 years, such as Chernobyl, such as Fukushima. CANDUs are not immune from big accidents. And the only other reason to avoid doing it would be cost, and that means that you're assuming that the lives and safety of Ontarians living close to the plants are not as important as the economic interests of the operators, and I can't imagine that the government will hold that opinion once they hear from Ontarians.
Is there a cost to enhancing the plan?
Well, I think the cost is moderate. There would be a cost of doing the actual planning, imagining where your alternate reception centers are in the case of evacuation, in case the one you had planned for couldn't be used. The KI pills have already been ordered and are in stock. In the case of 10 kilometers, they've been pre-distributed, but beyond 10, they have not. They're just sitting in shelves somewhere unused. So that cost has already been incurred. And then, of course, there's the requirement to train municipal staff and first responders. But I think these costs are very moderate compared to the actual prevention that can be incurred by taking these measures.
Two things in follow-up to that is also with costs, it's reactor operators that would bear those costs. So Ontario Power Generation, Bruce Power. And that's one of the reasons why we see a conflict with what the government's been doing since Fukushima, which is talking to reactor operators behind closed doors on how to change those plans. There's a clear financial interest for them to minimize expanding them. And then to add to what Teresa was saying about, we think we're on the same side here. The government on other files and issues has made a commitment to open government and transparency and evidence-based decision making. And if you look at our position statement, one of the key thing we're asking for is let's just see let's first model what a major nuclear accident would look like so the public and municipalities can understand what emergency measures may be needed, and then we can have a discussion about what those trade-offs will be. That's fair. But we haven't had that since Fukushima. There has been no studies of what such an accident would look like in Canada, especially Toronto, but other countries have done it. Germany, Switzerland, all modeled these types of things, released them to the public, had discussions, expanded emergency measures, but here we've seen a huge resistance to it, and I think part of the reason is the siting of 10 of our reactors. We have 10 reactors in the GTA, and the government doesn't want to have that discussion. So while I think we're on the same side on transparency and evidence-based decision-making, I think there is some tension with the government's agenda on keeping these reactors operating. But that's why we need transparency, is to have that discussion openly so the trade-offs can happen in public.
You're saying they're trying to do this quietly so that they don't stoke any fear among people who might be living closer to these plants?
I think they've been overly scared of that, frankly. As I said, in Switzerland, they released such modeling and the sky didn't fall. In Switzerland, they direct deliver KI pills to everyone within 50 kilometers of their plants. 50 kilometers, like almost the whole country. 4 million people received those pills after Fukushima, and they still have reactors operating. But they did that based on modeling that said in such an event, they would need that. So we should have that measure in place. And if you look at what happened here with the KI debate, is the distribution of KI and availability of KI should have been made by the province. It's the province's responsibility to do off-site emergency planning. But that requirement that's there now was actually imposed by the federal regulator when they heard over and over post-Fukushima from interveners in the public that other countries were doing this, but Ontario was dragging its feet. And so there's a bit of, that's where you start to see some of the resistance. But I don't think the sky would fall. But I think we would have a difficult discussion, but it's a needed one. And I think that discussion is in line with the values that the government has communicated that it stands for.
So how do people find out currently if they are eligible to pick up these KI pills? I mean, you said that within 10 kilometers it's delivered, but otherwise?
So there's been very little communication. In the case of the Bruce plant, they did better. They sent a coupon to everybody within 50 kilometers telling them they could pick up their KI pills, and my understanding is that they've had substantial uptake. In the case of Durham Region and Toronto, there was a little bit of media and communication at the time that they were first made available. There was some reporting by the Toronto Star, for example, and we heard from officials that following that media that there was an uptake in people putting their postal code on the website and getting the KI pills mailed to them. But we think there needs to be ongoing, assertive, aggressive communication to people to get these KI pills taken up. When, following the Fukushima accident, Canada hosted an international conference on nuclear regulators, and the regulator from France told us, Sean Patrick and I and another colleague were NGO delegates there, told the conference that they had made available the KI pills and there had been very little uptake, and they just thought it was so important they just direct mailed them as well to everyone in their primary zone. But as Sean Patrick indicated, subsequent studies and modeling in many countries have shown that depending on weather patterns and what actually happens on a bad day, you could need people in a broader zone to have those KI pills. And the biggest issue for the KI pills is children, pregnant women and children. What they do is they block the uptake of radioactive iodine from the plant, so they help prevent thyroid cancer down the road, and that's what we saw after Chernobyl, is a very large incidence of thyroid cancer following that accident. So it's a preventive measure. It's certainly not a panacea. We don't want anyone to think that, but it's an important and demonstrated measure, and it's only effective if people consume KI either within a couple of hours before an emission or right at the very beginning of an emission. And the Health Canada data shows that the effectiveness tails off very rapidly in the hours after the radioactive emissions begin from the plant. So you really want it already in people's hands.
Did the government put the cart before the horse in agreeing to do these refurbishments at Bruce Power and at Darlington without having this new plan finalized?
We would say yes, because in my view, and I said I've looked in detail at the emergency plans for the licensing hearings, and I've looked at the international guidance, including the guidance on siting the plants, and the Government of Ontario has continued to make decisions putting increased population in Durham under the Places to Grow Act, which I think is contrary to the siting guidance that's given internationally in terms of the population you want around a plant. And that guidance says that you should, on an ongoing basis, be reviewing your population density and reviewing the suitability of the site for the plant. And both the decision to extend Pickering beyond the date that was originally contemplated for its closure, which will be tested at the CNSC next year, as well as the decision to refurbish the plants, I think is crucially dependent on the safety of those plants at the locations where they occur. And then on top of that, we would argue you have alternatives.
And the main theme, we mentioned there's been Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearings since Fukushima for Darlington, Bruce, and Pickering on the proposals to prove the life extensions. And the main theme from public interveners was Ontario's emergency plans aren't adequate. That's why KI was imposed on the province. And they were speaking out at CNSC hearings because there's been no public venue from the Ontario government to do that. And that's unfortunately, and that needs to be fixed moving forward. They should not be deferring to the federal government on this. And as I mentioned in my comments off the top, we asked after Fukushima we should take a pause to do this. And I think for next steps, the government still has to give final approval of the Pickering continued operation until 2024 and 2018. We would like to see some of this public modeling before that decision is made. You have 7 million people living within 100 kilometers of that plant. When that plant, the initial decision to eventually close the plant was made, a CNSC staffer came up to me and said, you know, it's probably a good idea given where the plant is. And that acknowledges something that everyone knows that's common sense, is that you shouldn't be running a reactor in the middle of a major city. But that fact doesn't appear in any regulatory guidance anywhere. So before we wrote to the minister, I think in March, and we asked her to provide modeling on a Fukushima scale accident at Pickering before the final decision on Pickering. And we hope to see that because we need to have that decision. To get to your point about the cart before the horse, we need to have that information on the table before the government makes the final decision.
I also just want to reiterate the fact that we have this discussion paper from the provincial government is definitely a very excellent initiative. Consulting on the planning basis, this is the chance for the public to speak up and say, in addition to ourselves, as they've done at these, hundreds of people have attended these licensing hearings to talk about their concern about being able to respond to a Fukushima type accident. So this is a good initiative, and now we truly hope that the government will actually pay attention to the real needs for emergency planning in the area. And and then absolutely we would support those discussions about are the plants even in the right place? Should they be operating? Should they be refurbished? Vis-a-vis safety. But to the extent those decisions are being made to keep operating those plants, all the more reason we need much, much better nuclear emergency planning in Ontario than we have.
Any other questions?
Thank you
very much.